Awesome, thanks, Carolee. So kia ora koutou e te whānau, nei te mihi mai o ha ki a tātou katoa e hui. So I'm Andrea McIntosh, just warm welcomes in Te Reo, which is our one of our languages. It's our Indigenous language here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So yeah, great to be here, and let's get on with the webinar. So my apologies, I'm going to be a bit clunky. I've had to come into a shared office one of those days where I had to call a tradie in a hurry. So yeah, Carolee will help me, no doubt. I get stuck between screens. So exactly what I've done here. So I just want to have a wee bit of a conversation starter just before we kick into things. Who is the most famous person that you've met? Just chuck something in the chat and let's have a bit of a... For me, it was Princess Diana, or at the time she was Lady Diana, and I was very young, and she touched my hand and I was very impressed and didn't wash my hand for the rest of the day. So that's me. Oh, you're on mute there, Narelle, if you were going to contribute to that.
I was going to say, but it's really embarrassing. Brendan Favola, footballer.
Oh, so
Aussie
we've got a
rules
John
footballer.
Kerwin as well. So there you go, Aussie rules and rugby. Okay, everyone's a bit holding back on their name-dropping stories today.
I know, I can't think of anyone. My parents met Nelson Mandela, though, so that's quite cool.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll carry on. So what is a record? So if we think about what a record is, sorry, Carolee, I've jumped one ahead. You're going to do a poll before we jump into this.
No problem. I've just popped the poll in the chat for those that don't have the little Slido button at the top, but let me just launch that poll. It opens. There we go.
So hopefully everyone can get on there and let us know where you're at in your records management journey and what sort of drew you to this this webinar. How are we looking there, Carolee?
Yep, we're getting responses in. Can you see them or not?
I can't, otherwise I'm
okay, that's right.
lose the screen.
Yep, no, that's right. We've had 13 people respond, so we've majority is saying hold on, they work with applications or systems that manages records and need to know more. Yep. And also a leader that is information and records management within my brief. It's going between those two.
Okay, so that's really good. So we don't have many new records management role people here, no. And you all have an idea and you know what day it is. So that's really good as well. So I guess it's one of the refreshing things for me that I see when people are coming to records management webinars is that, you know, there is that uptake on people who are more in the sort of systems focused roles that are getting really interested in records management as part of their brief, as part of their workday. And that's really good. You know, if we sort of reverse that 10 years ago, there was a real line between records management and information systems or IT management. So that's really good to see that crossing over now. So what is a record? So our ISO standard for records management, the foundation standard for records management, is what's called ISO 15489. We actually launched the latest version of that here in New Zealand in 2016, so a bit of Kiwi pride there. The definition of a record in that standard, and just keeping in mind that standard language is, quite technical, is information created, received, and maintained as evidence as an asset by an organisation or a person in pursuit of legal obligations or in the transaction of business. So that's the definition of what is a record. So you can see some key things in that definition is about creating information or receiving it, and it's used as evidence as an information asset within the business. So then we go, well, we've kind of learnt what a record is. So what is a records management, or what is a records management team person, whatever, do when they look after the records? So again, going to the ISO 15489 is records management, field of management responsible for the efficient and systematic control of the creation, receipt, maintenance, use and disposition of records, including processes for capturing and maintaining evidence of and information about business activities and transactions in the forms of records. Whew, that's a big definition there, but you can still see that coming through, like what is a records and what is records management. There's key things in there. So it's, it's about creation and maintaining. So here in New Zealand, our Public Records Act is really clear that records management is that whole sort of create and maintain way of looking after information over time. So the other key thing in the definition of what records management is that it involves roles and responsibilities, things like secure storage, disposing of records, and preservation over time. And for those of you on the call today who are, more in that application side of things, it's around implementing systems to protect and preserve our records as well. So it's all very well understanding what a record, what's records, and what is records management. But I think it's really important, and this is particularly true when we go out to the business and we start talking to them about what records management is, taking that stance of, what are the benefits? What's in it for me? What is good going to happen in the business when I do records management well? So I think the mistake that we make at times is that as we go in with the compliance hammer, if you like, but compliance is the end result of doing good records management. So, to get people to do good records management, we need to be talking to them about the benefits to the organisation. So some of the benefits are that increased accountability. There's also some cost reduction. So that's where, if we're talking to people in sort of that financial leadership role and we start talking about the reduction of costs, that's going to help our records management strategies and getting the resourcing that we need for it. The other thing is good records management is critical for managing our disaster or recovery or business continuity. So we saw that through COVID, like the places that didn't have a good records management governance or framework are the ones that struggled when they needed to work differently or needed to make decisions really quickly around the COVID response. So, that links to that whole better decision support. So if we've got information about our past that we can lean into, that helps our future. So the records that contain decisions that we made last week, last month, last year become really important to preserve, because we're going to need them in the future to help us make further decisions. The other key thing around records management is that whole protection of memory. So it's the protection of memory as a community, as a country, also within our own internal organisation. So that whole corporate memory. I've talked about this in the past where there's organisations that seem to have some form of, corporate amnesia, like they don't quite know what happened in the past, and that's due to the fact that the records weren't managed well. So you can imagine, what that's like is not knowing what happened in the past, how can we lean in on that to move forward. So one of the things that is really key to managing our records well is the whole, looking at it through that life cycle lens. So the life cycle lens helps us to not be so reactive in what we're doing in records management. You can see on this slide that the information lifecycle or the records management lifecycle starts right at the beginning, and that's around the processes of planning and looking at that records management by design. So those of you, who are looking at systems or applications, those of you who are leading people in this area or records management as part of your brief, then this is around, having a look at what you can do up front before the records are even created. So what can we do up front to, before people start creating these records? It might be systems, it might be process, it might be people, making sure people are trained. Creation and capture happens, and then we have that whole active use, and then we start looking at things like preservation and retention or disposal over time. So, if we go back to that definition, it's all about looking after the creation, looking after that information over time and making sure that we preserve it well. And then, from a records management perspective, making sure we're doing that whole transfer or destruction. From a systems perspective, if you see at the right-hand side there, we've got historic archiving. Sometimes in that whole sort of less active retention and historic archiving space, we can look at doing things like archiving off to different systems for the purpose of having our applications run well, but still maintaining that records management. So those are all things that we, particularly in the modern workplace that we're in at the moment, is we really need to be constantly thinking about that records management upfront by design every time we change systems in the 365 world, in particular in our modern workplace, things like Teams. COVID was a great example of where we put these new systems in place, but we didn't think about that planning, or we didn't have opportunity to do that planning and RM records management by design. And now we're having to go back and look at that. So digitisation. Digitisation in the whole records management space is another area where we can enhance the usability of our records in the business process. So often when we think of digitisation, we think of those big back capture pieces of work. There was, a real trend to get those sorts of projects stood up not that long ago. Particularly, so my experience is mainly in the local government area, and picking up those property files and digitising them, and then making the content of them through OCR, as well as wrapping metadata around them to make things like visual information searches work better, is an example of where we're solving a records management problem, so preservation or making those records accessible, as well as a business problem, so getting that Lagoima process or official information process working much more efficient. So again, we've got our records management as well as our benefits to the business, which is great, when the two things work together. So one of the things that we look at within the courses that LTD do is just a little bit more of a deeper dive on the things that we need to consider in digitisation, such as specifications. There's a little bit of project management and the approach for back capture in there. The other thing that we need to be sure of is that our process for digitisation is really sound. So there's that whole, authenticity of records and making sure that they're like for like, and that we, there's that auditability of the whole process that surrounds digitisation. So we're just going to do another poll now. Thanks, Curly. So this one is just, see if you actually digitise records.
Hopefully everyone can see that launch there.
Okay, so Carol has just said there's 2 answers. So yeah, a bit of back capture and a bit of looking for opportunities as well, which is not uncommon.
It looks like we actually look for opportunities in this area is the common poll response.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. But and it's something that we need to encourage more and more. Digitisation is not just about, picking up that paper and turning it into a digital information asset. Sometimes the whole digitisation is about taking the business process and removing some of the paper heavy aspects of it. So, looking at things like digital signatures as well. So sort of that digitalisation. But in the context of records management, we always need to be thinking about digitisation as a way of looking after our records over that life cycle. And when we do digitisation, making sure that it's a really well-run project, or, if it's something that's going to be done as BAU, piece of paper comes in from the customer, somebody then scans it and saves it into SharePoint, for example, that we're utilising some of those tools to make sure that we're wrapping really good metadata around it, so that the information is findable. There's nothing worse than a digitisation piece of work and putting it all into a share drive or a big bucket and then not having that metadata wrapped around it so we can find it. So again, we do talk about that a little bit more on the course, in terms of some of those things that need to be considered around digitisation. My experience in the area is that I have done both. So sort of that back capture as well as working on business processes for day forward. And both of them are fun, I have to say. So kind of carrying on from digitisation, one of the things that I see happening at the moment is there's this real push for modern workplace projects, and that's super exciting. And we're going in an incredible direction with records management, and particularly records management in place. So in the likes of SharePoint, just looking after those records where they're born in those digital systems. But what we really need to be mindful of is there's still paper. There is still paper in our organisation. So when we're thinking about our records management strategy, take a little bit of time just to think about what the paper strategy is as part of that. So we've talked about digitisation. It may be, there may be some preservation stuff in there. The other thing is to make sure that we're reducing the likelihood of new paper to arrive if we can. So making sure that we're looking after the records that were created, born physical, as well as being mindful of where we can create records that are born digital so that we stop those records coming in. So records held in a physical form, you know, they do need the care over time. There needs to be some really good preservation thinking in and around those records. Here in New Zealand, we have what's called vital and protected records, and a lot of those are still in a physical format. So we have some quite historical things like rating books or ledgers that need to be taken care of. One of the really great things about using a tool like SharePoint List, for example, is that we can start having the best of both worlds. We can make these physical assets discoverable, manage them well, look after them, you know, keep them where they need to be, but also using other tools, digital tools, to help present some of that metadata around it so that it becomes more discoverable across the organisation. So again, records management around that whole decision support. So having, you know, things served up so that we can understand our history in order to move forward. So there's no point in having all these records locked away in the box if we don't, you know, look after them well, but we don't actually know that they exist. So there's never any reference to them. So as part of the strategy, looking at those information assets that are in physical format is really key as well. And right on cue, I start talking about information assets. So information assets are just that. So they're our records and information that are critical to the business. So if we think about, you know, in an organisation, we have buildings. We look after those buildings. We look after, you know, all the stuff inside the buildings, the computers, the desks, and all of that. Information asset management is no different. So it's about understanding what information assets you have across the business and looking after these. Sorry, I'm just going to get a drink. You know, finding ways to look after these. Looking after these over time, as well as, you know, talking to those business owners in the business. So, you know, when we start putting together a list of what those information assets are, so here in New Zealand, we have an information asset register, and it's a templated approach where we can go through, you know, start having those conversations in the organisation, looking at all those information assets and finding out exactly what we've got in the organisation, and then identifying them, you know, what of these information assets need that higher level of records management. You know, are there some things out there that are just that sort of transitionary records, sort of administrative, that we're not too worried about? Or has somebody got, you know, a little app running that actually has some really key organisational records that we need to consider? So it's a way to gather the information about those assets and make sure that we're looking after it over time. The other benefit of going through the whole information asset process is that it sort of opens up that conversation around records management. So, you know, as a records manager, we've got to take every opportunity we can to inject our conversation into the organisation and build those relationships. And an information asset register is a really good way to do that. The other key thing around an information asset register is it helps your planning. So, you know, if you think about records management strategy, if we understand what we've got, if we understand how quickly it grows, whether that's, you know, we create another 20 boxes a year or we create another 20 gig a year for digital, we can start thinking about the strategy around that, you know, thinking ahead so we're not so reactive in the work that we do. So classification, retention policies and metadata. This is a good bunch of stuff to be thinking about. So yeah, just give me a thumbs up if you've already done a business classification, if you've been involved in that. You're seeing some thumbs there, Curly? I'm not seeing.
Yes, I was seeing some thumbs.
Cool. Yeah, so business classification scheme, sounds like some of you have already been involved in that. So, you know, the way we think about this is a hierarchy of information assets. So what we're seeing a lot of now is that the business classification scheme is very function, activity, and sub-activity focused. Rewind some years back, we, you know, took the approach of it being more subject based. So it was, you know, more about who was doing it and what it was about than actually that higher level of the function that is happening. So when we talk about function and activity based classifications, this makes it sustainable over time. So if if we look at some areas in the world where restructures happen, and if you recalled all your records based on the name of the department that was doing that job, then we would have a problem. We couldn't actually just move to a different department when they picked up the job. So it's function based. So an example of a function is human resources. Activity might be recruitment, and sub-activity might be advertising for recruitment. So that way it doesn't matter who actually does it or who contributes to it. They can all get on with contributing to that. The really good thing about function and activity base is that it's, you know, it provides a really good metadata framework when you're moving into the likes of SharePoint, when you're doing things like when we start looking at retention labels or aligning our retention schedule up against our records, as well as search and discovery. So if we're tagging things, if we're taking the opportunity to tag things based on function and activity, we can serve that up and change who needs to see that based on, you know, what their role is in the business, but still keep it in situ. So we're not having to duplicate information all over the place, which was a big problem with share drives. We had a folder for this person to see it and a folder for that person to see it, and information duplicated between the two. So looking at our retention policies, so again, we align these to our classification. So I've used the example of function activity there. We have retention policies or retention schedules. So these are the rules that we apply to the records. So, you know, a classic example there is if we have the function of finance and we have the activity of accounts payable, more than likely our rule is going to be 7 years, which aligns to inland revenue type rules. So we also, you know, when we're looking at our retention policies, there is that consideration of privacy. So when we're, you know, applying things like customer requests, for example, we have a retention period that makes sense from a, you know, from a having it for the records of the business, understanding it, you know, maybe reporting on it, but also we get rid of it in a timely manner because people have the right to be forgotten in a lot of cases. And, you know, we should only ever be keeping our records for as long as we need it in order to do our business. So yeah, there's a definite relationship between retention and our records management and other pieces of legislation like privacy that come into play there. So metadata, I'm sure a lot of you know what metadata is. Basically, it's data about data. I always think about it of, it's the label on the outside of the can of baked beans. So, it's the stuff that tells you the story of what's in there. I actually grew up in Gisborne. So Gisborne over here in New Zealand, Watties, which is a cannery that makes all sorts of things, was where most people worked back in the day. And one of the things that we would get is what we used to call as kids mystery cans. So you used to go to the cupboard and there was a tray of cans with no labels, and you'd sort of rattle it. And it would be you'd be thinking fruit salad and open it up and it'd be sweet corn because it sounded like fruit salad. But without the label or the metadata on it, it was a mystery can. So yeah, it's tells you what the information or the records is about. It tells you, how long do we look after this record? How long, what's ingredients is it? Does it relate to finance or does it relate to HR? It might have some, some things that you need to be aware of. Don't give to people under the age of 7, for example. So then we've got some things around permissions. Who can actually access that mystery can? So, there are things in the way that we manage records as well, which Public Records Act New Zealand, we have standard sets of metadata that we have to include for every record. So that's, things like the create date and the creator. So when we're looking at developing our metadata structure or taking it from our classification scheme, we need to think about that core metadata that is around the management of the records, as well as the metadata that is helpful. So when we think about the benefits of records management, what metadata is helpful to the organisation to make it easier to find, easier to make decisions on, easier to share or collaborate on as well. And the other thing is the whole retention sort of metadata, making sure we're keeping things for only as long as we need it. So aligning those to things like labels and SharePoint as well. Thank you all for the feedback on the mystery can analogy. I do like, takes me back to my childhood every time I share that story. So we've talked sort of at a very, the higher level around records management. What is a record? What is record management? What is, what are the benefits to the business? What's physical? How do we digitize? Things like that. So then we're going to go on and talk about sort of pulling together that stuff as a strategy, right? So, I've talked about that earlier in the presentation as well, that records management, we're all about compliance. I love compliance. If I had my time again, I'd be a lawyer. But it needs not to be that as part of your strategy moving forward. So it's about building a strategy that helps your organisation do the right thing, manage records well, tie into their strategy. So that's a key as well, is, what's HR's strategy? Okay, how can I tie into that for some records management so we both get wins, and then it becomes a business benefit? So understanding things like, if HR on their strategy have something in place where they're going to, do online recruitment as an example, that's where we can build that into our records management strategy, support them, but also ensure that they're doing the right things by the records that are generated by that online recruitment. So, the other thing around that records management strategy needs to be, and it's like any business strategy, right? We need to create our brand as records management or information management people. So again, creating our brand is about conversations. It's about getting out there amongst the business and empowering the business to do the right thing around records management, encouraging them to come on a course like this, or a webinar like this is a great thing to do. And then you start talking that same language. We've come a long way in our sector, and probably in the last, sort of 10 years, we've had to move at pace to keep up with what's happening in business, and particularly in technology. So, we can get more traction for our work and our strategies if we can align what we're doing with the business. And it kind of swings and roundabouts too. Once we have those conversations, the business can start doing what we need to do in records management as well. So just to, recap those benefits, decision support, it's, our records are there so that we can lean into them in the future, that we can learn from them, that we can, have evidence of what we're doing. So that's sort of the key thing, preserving our history and making sure that, and there's a lot of things happening in our world that history or the records, are coming to the forefront of some really strong conversations, and they're actually providing, not just that emotion that comes with some of those strong conversations, but, evidence. So being able to sit down and go, yeah, well, this happened on the day, let's look at this. The other thing that, the benefits of records management is with our users, with our people within the organisation, the better that we manage records or information, the better our knowledge base becomes. And we see this a lot as we're moving out of that sort of siloed records management into that modern workplace, is we're seeing more informed people across the organisation. And because we do it so that when they're creating records, it's got all the metadata around it, and records are managed well up front. So if we think about that life cycle, we're putting things in place so that the users are doing the right thing. They become more competent, and so therefore they're more happy about records management. It's not seen as a back office job. It's part of the inner workings of the organisation, and it's actually, records management is an incredible asset to the organisation as well. So as always, what supports our strategy? Policies and procedures. So, when we're thinking about strategy, if our strategy is, all records must be kept in a SharePoint, our strategy is a SharePoint, then, we might have a procedure that supports that, or a policy that supports that. And some of that, might be a policy that is more IT facing, so a bring your own device type policy. We can input into that policy some records management stuff to make sure that it's happening as well. If our strategy is around digitisation, for example, we'll have some procedures wrapped around that. So, having a procedure for born paper records, part of that procedure to turn them to digital, as close to the business front as we can, will be part of that procedure. So, the one thing that we need to do in policies is strike that balance of, that compliance stuff. That stuff is really important, don't get me wrong, but having it in a way that we're doing our policies that is actually what I call a friendly policy. So we see that a lot in health and safety policies. So, we kind of see that, if people were to put in a poster hanging on the wall at the factory, the actual health and safety legislation, to the word, people don't get it as much as a policy poster that sort of highlights the key points, and here is all the details. So when we're thinking about those policies and procedures, again, think about our strategy, think about our branding as records managers, and think about making sure that we're empowering the business to do the right thing by default. So training. So training's key, right? So we often see people getting really sort of stressed out because they don't have the right training to be able to do what's needed of them. And that's super unfair on people if we expect people to do things but don't actually support what they're doing with training. So, that's the same for us. So continued professional development for records managers is really important. The pace of change is incredible. Like, we have to keep up with so much at the moment, in terms of everything that's coming at us that's new, 365, all the new things happening in there, but also in our world in general. So thinking about, if we think about physical records, they were super simple to manage. There was kind of this core set of training that you did to know how to catalog records, to know how to store them well, to know how to move them to off-site storage. But our world is much more complex than that now. So, we're taking that model of physical records management and then having to apply it to things that, one looks like a can of fruit salad and one looks like a can of corn. We just don't have that consistency in what we're doing now. So, keep training, keep yourself trained. Part of our branding, get out into the business and look at what training opportunities we have that will increase our engagement with the organisation. So bring people along for the ride. Inject some coaching into it as well. Just get, it's not about compliance. It's about building capacity for records management in the organisation. Having those RM skills is really important moving forward. People will think and have really robust conversations if they know what they're talking about. And at the moment, a lot of our people, our users, don't know what they don't know. So we can't actually expect them to do the right thing if they don't even know what that right thing is. So yeah, getting out there, getting our people trained, making sure we're keeping trained, keeping our own continued development up and running is a really important thing moving forward. So we talked a little bit about information asset registers already, so I won't go into too much detail at this point, but just to reiterate that it is a tool that can be used across the organisation to inform, other strategies. So the other thing it can be used for is some of that training stuff as well. So, if we're going out there to look at our information asset registers and we see that, part of the business is using Power Apps for, collecting some customer information out in the field, for example, that's a training opportunity. So using that information asset register to have a training opportunity as well. The other thing is it can be used as a risk tool. So if we think about one of the benefits of records management is, that business continuity, disaster recovery. If we look at our information asset register and we start taking a risk lens on that, we can talk to the risk managers in the organisation and start having those conversations with them about records risk. And it's amazing how much buy-in you get for resourcing when records management becomes a business risk, in terms of if we lost all this stuff, this big list of stuff that's in our information asset register, we've got problems. We can't run our business. We can't have customer information that's critical when we need it. So yeah, using it as a risk tool as well. So enhancing the profile of records management. I actually really love this slide and the way that it that whole true love is born from understanding. So in my experience, when I first entered a records management role, I was all like, you know, no, thou shalt kind of an attitude. And it took me a long time to actually take a different approach and understand the business, take the time to understand the business, and having that, you know, shared understanding or shared goals. So, you know, again, comes down to the brand, it comes down to some of those coaching things. Ensuring that the business, you know, true love is born for us as well. So ensuring that the business are given opportunity to understand our world. So what does records management mean? Getting them trained, you know, inviting them along to lunch and learns, you know, sharing training opportunities around to them. Building partnerships and other projects and strategies is always a good way to go. And sometimes it just takes a little bit of wait for the right moment to inject that records management yearbook. So yeah, I really like that. So it's been a big win for me over the years. Many of the wrinkles that I have are from not having that understanding between projects and records management, but I treasure them because it's taught me how important the branding, the enhancing the profile of records management, the being a partner in the business, and being, you know, being at that seat at the table and talking about projects and bringing along the records management stuff is really important. So the last poll for the session is, what does success look like in your records management journey? So Carolee's just going to pop that one up.
Yep, it's there. Might take a little longer to get some responses because it's obviously open type.
My success is never opening a can of corn again if it's actually fruit salad that I'm after.
Oh, we've got a few coming in here. So end user can do their work without having to think about record retention. It's done.
Awesome.
Information at our fingertips, easy to find. Capture of the top 20% of records, compliance, digital transformation adoption.
Love that. Yep.
Having the business see the value of getting rid of data information that is beyond its lifestyle. Don't keep it all.
Yes.
People having the information they need when they need it. The business start to do it well for themselves. Nirvana.
Yeah.
Do you want me to keep reading these?
No, that sort of sums up what we've talked about, right?
Yeah.
So users doing the right thing by default, looking after information over our life cycle, so getting rid of it when we need to get rid of it or preserving it for the future, as well as users doing the right thing by default, encouraging our users, supporting our users. So yeah, we're on a great journey. I'll hand back to you, Carolee, unless there's any questions.
No questions? Nope. So we've just got some QR codes there that show our next, so we've got a records management training course on the 15th of February, and then the deep dive that's the follow on from that on the 8th of March. So you can use those QR codes there to log in and join those if you want to. Also, if you've got any questions, obviously just come to myself or Narelle, and yeah, we can help you out with that. So I think that's about it. Thank you, Andrea, too, for all the information today and for taking your time.
Awesome. No, it's my pleasure.
Excellent. And I'm getting lots of thank yous coming through.
Yeah,
and Merry Christmases. So yeah, Merry Christmas to everyone as well.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you for all being here, and yeah, love these opportunities to talk to my friends out there in the profession. So take care, everybody.
Bye, everyone.